Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from Cape Town here in the Western Cape, South Africa. The podcast is presented with a view to providing a platform and voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It's dedicated to the individuals and community groups who are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. Welcome to our latest episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Today we consider the Township Economy, the people, the spaces and the practices that are shaping the fortunes of many of our communities in South Africa. Our conversation sees three authors of the book, The Township Economy, People, Spaces and Practices. Charman, Thireshen, Govender and Leif Petersen talk about the transformation potential of the informal economy, the power relations and the adaptive strategies that allow micro-enterprises to thrive or conversely to falter. Having bought the book and been intrigued by the case studies and the spatial data they've incorporated, I wanted to ask them more about the inspiration behind the book, the research method and the findings. What are the opportunities? What are the trends? And what are some of the risks that are faced by those who are reliant on the informal sector for their livelihood? What is it we should be doing better, and how best can we facilitate and unlock growth and potential of micro-enterprises? The book itself covers a range of sectors and industries, including transportation, retail, food and the liquor trade, and also social infrastructure of the township, things like educational care and traditional healing. They've chosen 9 township sites across South Africa and 1 in Namibia to test these themes and explain the practices and the people that are shaping them in our communities. The book and the research will appeal to any practitioner or academic who's looking at these issues associated with socioeconomic development, anthropology, land use, urban design, or entrepreneurial behaviour here in South Africa. There really is something for everybody in this book. At a time in our history where a national lockdown has disrupted fundamentally both the formal and informal economies, the content and recommendations made by Thireshen and Leif are vital resources for us to consider. This episode is dedicated to the memory of Walter Few, an agent of spatial transformation, a visionary and an outspoken voice of the Young Planning Brigade, an avid supporter of the podcast and a very good friend. The country has lost a true diamond, and I'd like to pass on condolences to all of Walter's friends and his family. This is for you, Walter. Enjoy the episode. So it's just coming up to 5:45 here in Cape Town on January the 27th. It's a Tuesday afternoon, and welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. And thanks so much to our guests this afternoon. Based up in Johannesburg, we've got Charman, Thireshen, Govender and Leif Petersen. Welcome, colleagues, and thanks so much for joining us. Andrew, let's start with you. How are you keeping, and where do we find you today?
Good, thank you. Great to connect with you, Peter. I'm super excited by this opportunity. I couldn't have thought of a more appropriate place to talk about a book. I think the book speaks to the topic of talking transformation, and I'm really hoping that we can explore some of the issues that we raise in this text. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity, Peter. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I say thank you, Andrew. Thanks for your time. And Thireshen, where do we find you, sir? How are you keeping?
Yeah, I'm well. Thanks again for the opportunity. I think that I find when you talk about where you find us, I'm interested not just in geography, which is Joburg with Hardy does in the background, but I think we're also in a really interesting kind of political moment in our times, and I think it's a time where we are seeking for another way to make our collective lives together, and I think that we'd like to make a contribution towards that.
Fantastic. Looking forward to that contribution very, very much. And Leif, how do we find you? Whereabouts do we find you today? How are you keeping?
Yeah. Thanks. Awesome. It's Peter. It's great to be hosted on the podcast, and you'll find me right now having the quintessential 2021 experience, which is being in isolation because I was recently exposed to someone with COVID-19. So it's great to be able to do things like podcasts from such a place. I think it's also a really important reality check because the world has changed so unbelievably quickly and in ways that no one could really predict. And I think that really speaks to so many things about, the development world in which we're in. And it's really interesting to be able to have the chance to talk about that in the show tonight.
this is a difficult time. It's a difficult time not only in terms of the political history of the country, but in terms of dealing with this global pandemic. We've seen the formal economy across the country really taking a pounding. Unemployment rates are going through the roof. The lockdown, whether it's through the government regulation or through self-isolation, as you described there, Leif, all of us have been taking a knock. And certainly the formal sector and the private sector in particular really has never, really been very vulnerable. The informal sector and the township economy, which you've published this book a year ago, really, I would argue on the one hand, has never been more relevant in terms of its contribution and security to many of our communities and those trying to find their way in the township economy, but also at the same time being probably as vulnerable as it's ever been. And that's my opening sort of statement to the three of you, is to say, we'll talk about the book, but at this moment in time, a year on from it having been published, we find ourselves in a very precarious situation. Do you think that's a fair assessment of the state of play in terms of the informal sector and the township economies that you've covered in the book? Maybe, Andrew, you'd like to kick us off and then we can go round robin.
Absolutely relevant is yes. I think more and more people are going to be reliant on self-employment, micro-enterprises, entrepreneurship in the coming months, possibly years. So the informal economy and the township economy is absolutely relevant. And I also think there is a relevance at the policy level where government is beginning to acknowledge that it is not capable of creating the jobs that it has promised. The more vulnerable is also a yes. What we've learned from years of work is that the informal economy, the township economy, is inextricably connected to the formal economy. And when we see a slowdown in the informal economy, that has a corresponding impact on the township economy. And we've documented that quite clearly. I would like to add a small caveat to those statements. And that is to say that our book is really about people who defied the odds in transforming the townships, creating enterprises from essentially a zero beginning. So beginning with few resources, few opportunities, spatial constraints, and rebuilding an economy out of nothing. So at the same time, one could also ask that one could also say that there's never been more opportunity than before.
Leif, do you want to come in there? Some of your thoughts, are you in agreement with Andrew on this?
Yeah, Peter, I do agree with Andrew. I think that we really are in a unique space and time. And one of the big things that really struck me in our years of work in the township economy is, the book goes into quite great depth about findings and about, different kinds of businesses and the like. But one of the really big overarching things that we learned is that there are, as part of common belief, and this is true, is that the great many businesses we see within the township economy are survivalist enterprises. So these are individuals who are making quite rational choices to be able to run small, individual self-employment style businesses, whether it's street trading or trading in goods and services, and often those businesses make really quite sensible, logical sense. The pandemic, I think, has created such a knock on the formal sector, as you've mentioned, that the role for survivalist businesses is only going to get bigger. But that said, when we talk about survivalist businesses, I think one of the things that is quite striking for me was that they're actually, for many of the people who operate them, they're quite sensible life choices, and they're quite sensible, rational decisions that are made behind those businesses. And I suspect that we really could be doing a lot more, certainly from a policy side, to be getting the survivalist business environment in better shape, because a lot of what holds them back are factors that are often beyond the business's control, such as the illegality of trading in the street or the geographic isolation of the township from the mainstream economy. And I think that there are many of the features that are quite structural that hold these businesses back. And I think the pandemic and COVID represents a real opportunity for a reset as to how we think about the township and how we think about the geography and the economy of the township, and how we can get to a point where possibly at some point in the future we don't need to talk about a township economy anymore. We can just talk about the economy.
to somebody who doesn't understand the differentiation, if you're explaining to somebody from overseas, how would you go about describing this phrase of township economy to those who are hearing it for the first time, and what has in the past differentiated it from the formal economy, and who's sort of operating in that space? You're saying these things are starting to blur even more, but I mean, from a sort of traditional standpoint, how have you understood that?
It all starts with a kind of an ongoing debate, which was kind of started many years ago in West Africa, looking at informality and informal economy. And then it's kind of in South Africa, it was this big discussion which was led by Thabo Mbeki around the whole idea that the informal economy was somehow separate. It was he described the South African economy as the double-decker bus, and the formal mainstream economy was on the top floor, and the informal poor economy was on the bottom floor, and there was no ladder, there was no stairs to connect them. I think a lot of that theory has kind of been changed over time, particularly with like in the work we're doing, where, as Andrew's mentioned, there's a lot of inextricable linkages between the two. But what we're looking, particularly in the township economy, I guess we're looking primarily at the undocumented, outside of the regulated economy kinds of businesses. And so these are the businesses that are generally, informality is not an exclusive state. Some people pick and choose the bits of formality that suit them. So maybe they have a trading permit, but they're not registered for SARS. Or maybe they have a particular operating permits, such as operating a minibus taxi, but at the same time, there are no employment contracts for the drivers or for the individuals who work there. So it's a fuzzy area. But basically, we go on the premise of the majority of the enterprises are not taxed, nor are they documented in terms of income tax, nor are they documented. I think that for us was the kind of the entry point. And then, townships in themselves, are home to such a great many millions of South Africans, and they provide a very different perspective on the South African economy. I think the term that's been used before was it's the majority economy, which it certainly is in the rest of the world. So I think that for us, it was looking at the township economy as both a geographic place, but also a place where there is a fundamentally different and often non-Western approach to how one operates a business and how that economy works. I think it's a very nuanced thing. There are many, many things within the township economy that make it quite unusual. And it's not this homogenous thing that's often painted by people as, it's the economy of the poor. It's highly nuanced. You have businesses and individuals such as survivalist street traders who are highly vulnerable, and they're literally trading, for income for that day. But you have others that are striving within the economy, such as taverns or people who are running shisonyamas or minibus taxis. We see townships that are both informal settlements, but we'll also find formal townships where you have, bricks and mortar bonded housing, all of which have businesses. And so the really interesting thing about the township economy, and I think something we've worked really hard at within the book, is to try and unpack it as not just this kind of thing that happens when you enter the township. It's actually a much more nuanced and subtle thing. And within that, there's an awful amount of detail that really helps you understand much more clearly about how it works, and about what the kind of levers are that you could be pulling and pushing in order to create better opportunities. And I think that for us as the township economy is it's a very interesting place to be.
And Thiresh, if we rewind to the genesis of your coming together, the three of you, and putting this book together, I think it was around 2010 that you started to put the idea, and it was about 7 years worth of research. And we're going to talk a bit about the case studies that you looked at and what informed that. But I mean, if you think back to that period of coming together and saying, right, we're going to spend a serious amount of time and effort in terms of our research methodology, what was it that prompted you to say this is the angle that you want to, or the theme that you want to test? Was there a problem statement or a series of propositions that were framing that initiative? And who ultimately were you wanting to target and get to respond and read the book?
I must confess it was a lot more of a stumble upon in terms of the output of the book. I think that we were driven by a kind of a naive curiosity in sensing that the world that we occupy and that we were interfacing with, especially in the townships, was something that was quite unique. It was something that yielded unbelievable sophistication and value, and we wanted to get into the mechanics of it. At least from my professional discipline, which is urban design and architecture, I felt that we were completely ill-equipped to deal with this. And what this started off with was to see how we could bring our discipline into the field and learn from the township economy, and see how the township economy could learn from our respective disciplines, which is social science and spatial logics. So I think that how we started this piece of it was an investigation into shebeens. And I remember that Andrew and Leif, we met at a conference in Cape Town a while ago, and they said to me, like, listen, there's an investigation we'd be interested to work with you on in a shebeen, and it would be interesting to draw this out. And one of the things that we had a conversation about was I asked what's the value of drawing? And one of the things that Leif and Andrew presented to me was they said that the drawing provides a granular, almost ethnographic piece of evidence as to how something's working. A lot more sophisticated than a dot, because there's a lot more happening at a granular level. And I thought that was a phenomenal kind of opportunity to get into the inner mechanics of how the township works within a particular sector at a very, very granular level using ethnography. So we started this project on looking at shebeens specifically, and within those things, within the study of the shebeens, we looked at the incredible sophistication of the way certain practices were being undertaken, spaces that were being made, and an economy that was built on the back of that. And that was where our interests converged. And following that, we were fortunate enough to expand that conversation into not just shebeens, but things like high streets, informal traders, transport systems, foods, spaza shops. And then the kind of project grew from that. So we looked at the various sectors or components within the township, within the similar curiosity. And then about 2 and a bit years ago, we were approached by the HSRC with an invitation to put this piece of work, this collection of work, into a book. And that became the point where we needed to be a little bit more reflexive to look at what had we done over the last 7 years. And that was where we put together the theoretical framing, understood the methods that we were doing. And fortunately, there was a rigor at which we approached the work. So it meant that we could justify each of the moves, the approaches that we've taken in each of the sites, and the way we undertook the studies. So, Peter, I think that we were saying that it's not like we started off with the first project to say, let's produce a book. It was more about let's feed a curiosity, and we tried to do this in the most integrous way possible. And we were fortunate enough to have a moment to put this together in the form of a collation and in the form of a book.
I think one of the things that really, Andrew and I talked for many years about the need for putting together a lot of the work we'd done into some kind of collection, I suppose. And one of the things that had really struck us over the years is like a lot of academic publications use a lot of macro data. So there's a lot of stats essay data that's used and extrapolated across very many different kinds of settings in South Africa. And unfortunately, a lot of the really high level data sets don't give you the nuance and the detail that is required if you really want to understand about how to engage within the township economy. And I think that for us, this book wasn't about measurement, it was about qualitative understanding. And I think it's such a shame that the humanities is so often kind of undervalued, I suppose, as a science in many ways, because understanding how businesses work and how the township economy functions is equally as important as knowing what the scale of the enterprise is and how much money they have. Because if you want to make an impact in terms of the development sector, if you want to create the jobs, you need to be able to know at which point to be intervening and providing support. And I think that for us was such an important thing to get across in this book, was to really not go down such an academic path. Yet, of course, it's an important academic book, but I think it was to approach the topic from a very different kind of approach. And I suppose, we've often described ourselves as kind of having quite dirty boots, because we spent a lot of time walking around in the township and being on the ground. And I think the three of us have had the real privilege of spending a lot of time being able to unpack and really get our heads around what it is we saw. And I think, we'll never really understand everything that's going on, but I think this book is a great opportunity for us to at least get what we know out there. And I think it's a great start.
Just one or two anecdotal memories from my side, Peter. When we began the work, we really began by following our nose. We didn't have an absolutely clear idea of where the research was going or what the results would look like. But we had a hunch that it was an interesting story to tell by documenting businesses and understanding the spatial relationships within these businesses. But very quickly, we learned that the spatial influence on enterprise activity was very important. And when we had a look at shebeens, which are unlicensed taverns or unlicensed bars or pubs, we found that the configuration of furniture, the use of objects, indeed the entire use of space, had a profound influence on the way recreation takes place within those venues. But we didn't know how to tell that story. And when we met Thireshen at the ACC conference that we all attended, and we saw some of the incredible work that he was undertaking with taxis and his ability to communicate very complex ideas through drawings, we thought that this was a perfect partnership. And we had no resources at all. And I remember saying to Thireshen, I really want to work with you, but I don't know where the money will come from. But one day, let's try and make it happen. And it was really the beginning of the journey. One day happened, and we began a collaboration, which we've sustained for a decade now.
Well, I mean, I must really commend the three of you from, as you say, such humble beginnings there at the conference at the ACC to what I'm looking at now and flicking through. And I mean, you know, I'm looking at exactly that. It's a book that's extremely rich with architectural drawings, urban design, spatial analysis, photographs. It's a visual treat, and together with that qualitative assessment that you talk of, Leif. And I mean, it clearly took a lot of thinking, and as much as the project must have, as you say, it progressed and adapted, and then the opportunity to put it together. Was there anything that you were insisting on from the get-go of, you know, that for each of those case studies, and maybe that's what we should talk about, is, you know, the case studies that you chose, I think it was 9 South African based. One of them was based in Namibia. How did you go about saying, okay, this is the minimum type of information that we require in terms of spatial, qualitative approaches?
You know, one of the things to maybe highlight up front is there's something consistent that drives the three of us and keeps our collaboration together is almost we have a frustration with the slow pace of change that's taking place. And we feel that if we are looking for the major disruption, it will not be coming from the professional kind of technical community, nor would it come from government, so to say. And we do feel that there is great intelligence and sophistication within our emergent economy, and we sniffing out those things that are going to be yielding some kind of invention and disruption, and something that has the capacity to bring great change. So one of the things that does guide our interest is things that are unconventional, something that is talking against our intuition or being completely counterintuitive, is kind of things that will attract our attention. And we have an interest in kinds of phenomena that are pushing against what we see often a regressive policy environment. And if they are able, through that regressive policy environment, are they able to crack really productive urban formations? Because we think that tension is quite a healthy one to work on. We are also interested in kind of those conditions that have the ability to be replicable, so that if we understand the mechanics of it, we have the ability to expand on them and see how they could be transferred to other sites. And we also take an interest in the relationship to the kind of urban condition, that we are people who believe in our future being quite urban. So the relationship of these kinds of emergent patterns of life being in relation to a really established urban geography is important to us. So you'll find that often our sites are in relation to urban centers, and they often have a relationship to our stubborn apartheid geography, because that is something that we need to talk to. So those are the kinds of prerequisites that we are looking at, and we find that often we had some like almost toxic kind of practices, especially around alcohol. And typically you'll find that at least my professional community kind of shies away from that. And they take a view that, alcohol is bad, which I can agree to. But on the back of the value chain of how alcohol is produced is a really fascinating urbanism from this. And I think that I was interested to operate almost like a documentary photographer in a war zone where you needed to distinguish very carefully between the multiple crimes that you are witnessing and try to demystify what is actually happening and bring some truth forward to this. And we often did the truth telling through the way we documented, through photographs, diagrams, drawings, storytelling. That is the kind of sites that we were driven to and why we found it valuable.
I think our selection of particular geographic sites was quite purposeful. We wanted to be able to reflect on the very diverse kinds of contexts that one would experience in the township economy. And I think it's very important to recognize that this is not a homogeneous space. Townships are tremendously diverse. So included in the list, we wanted some of the townships that were developed during the apartheid period that really bear the hallmark of very clearly intended segregationist spatial planning. But we also wanted to engage with the post-apartheid project, the development of RDP housing, and some of the new townships that were created after 1994. And be in a position where we could counterpose the old 1950s apartheid townships with this post-apartheid project. I think a third criteria that we considered was the reality that there has been a very significant growth in informal or unplanned settlements. And in many ways, I think some of these unplanned settlements are certainly the township future in the medium term, but possibly for many years to come. So we've included within the book a focus on some of these informal settlements. A fourth criteria was the position of the township relative to centers of economic development and opportunity. So some of our case studies are really stuck out very far from the vibrancy of the economy, but others are situated in prime positions. For example, in Imizamo Yetu, it's a township which spatially presents characteristics that are very similar to a favela, but yet it's situated very close to an extremely wealthy part of Cape Town and presents great employment opportunities for many of the residents. So in many ways, Imizamo Yetu is not certainly not the poorest of the cases that we looked at. Indeed, it's probably what people have considerably more wealth than in other cases. The final criterion was to look at sites that offered particular insights into some of these really intractable problems that we have in terms of economic development and spatial planning. And one of the clear examples within our book, we went to a township in Katutura in Namibia to look at a high street and to look at the potential of a high street as an economic spine, which provides a form of structure to ignite opportunities for businesses. So it was quite a purposeful selection of sites. Our sites cover a great geographic area. And one of the interesting things was that we nevertheless found quite a number of consistencies across these very diverse areas. So that to me was, I think, one of the big surprising findings from this piece of work.
I think one of the things that was particularly interesting across the different township settlements that we kind of investigated, there were a number of, I guess, that were apartheid built. So these are, there were settlements such as Tembisa, which have been around for 40 odd years, 50 years. But then you've also got places like Andrew's mentioned, Imizamo Yetu, which are profoundly new, and they represent effectively a post-apartheid kind of settlement that is completely, there's a small patch of RDP housing within it, but the majority of it is completely informal and completely kind of organically emerged. And this creates a really interesting kind of dynamic, because if you look at some of the older, more established townships, people are living in larger dwellings, they're living on larger pieces of land, there's often more effective infrastructure, so there can be tarred roads, there can be electricity. But obviously when you're looking in some newer settlements, as much as government have done a pretty remarkable job at building housing, we're also seeing a massive sprawl of slums, informality, dwellings that are just kind of popping up in every single piece of open space. So, I mean, the shack farming kind of debate that's going on in Cape Town right now is a great example of that. I mean, I think informality is driving a remarkable change in how the township economy is working, because we are seeing things happening before our very eyes, caused by COVID, economic pressures and other things as well. Taking all of these different contexts into account gives us a far stronger understanding around what you can do if you were going to try as a government, for example, to implement a town planning strategy or to implement an economic policy, because these are all the kinds of things that are the reality on the ground. And I think such an important part of the underpinning of our book was really trying to get that reality across to people, because so often that's not what we see when we are engaged in policy discussions or in academic kind of forums.
Thanks so much for expanding on that, Leif. I really appreciate it. And I mean, Thiresh, from your side, is anything you found that were either surprises or things that challenged your conventional thinking through 7 years of hard graft and these case studies that you considered?
I mean, there was incredible insights around how the township environment is not necessarily something that is built on opportunity, but more out of necessity, that there is incredible constraints on resources and amenity. And we find that there is the reactions or the responses that come out of it, out of necessity, within it is incredible inventiveness. And that inventiveness is one that has an incredible level of beneficiation in it. It brings incredible spatial complexity to the way our cities are made. And I think that I find that within the kind of township economy, which I sometimes call the frontier urbanism, we find some of the most progressive spatial strategies playing itself out in terms of how our lives become quite integrated in some way and interdependent. So I took great comfort in looking at how we could arrange a kind of collective existence along high streets, backyards, sidewalks, and sometimes our interiors to make quite a productive urbanism. So I found that the township economy for me is one of the most exciting arenas to be operating as a spatial practitioner in, and far exceeds one's imagination compared to some of the more established formal contexts that we work in. Second to that, I was just surprised at how, when we talk about its vulnerability, I think we're seeing some worrying signs around how we need to act very carefully, because the way the township economy is at, it's quite ripe and open, almost like an adolescent, and it does need some really important kinds of structures to guide it towards quite a productive and transformative future, because right now it is poised to become either quite a deviant teenager or something that's quite an enlightened part of our urban future.
I really like that analogy, Thiresh. I mean, it's always struck me that it is a very fine balance, it seems, between the regulatory environment that seeks to try and have a degree of conformity and structure to it, versus that informal economy that seems to at times either want to push back against that, or there seems to be a limit at which point it becomes overly burdensome, and that the benefit seems to be denuded by the regulation. So as you say, how do you deal with an errant teenager? Whether it's about an informal economy based on retail or whether it's based on accommodation. These are some of the major challenges that cities are having to come to terms with, and the governance elements. We've seen bad examples of it. I'm thinking of raids on informal trading in the Johannesburg CBD from years ago, which I don't think helped anybody very quickly. But I mean, any thoughts on that in terms of the balance between the regulatory and the sort of laissez-faire approach of this particular sector?
I think it's a very tricky issue that you've raised. On the one hand, weak regulation presents an opportunity. And for many businesses, the opportunity lies in the fact that the hurdles to setting up and to operating the business are much lower. People are able to trade in public space, on the verges of streets. They're able to operate essentially illegally, and in many cases sell products illegally. So there are certain advantages to informality and to allowing for a degree of flexibility towards the informal sector. So that's on the one hand, but I think we have to also look at the other hand. And the other hand, and one of the things that we learned in this process is the township economy is not agnostic to power. So power plays a very important role in the ordering of business, in defining which businesses dominate. And what we found is that within an informal context, the powerful often are businesses that exclude opportunities for some of the more marginal businesses. So we need to recognize that there are power dynamics. And one of the reasons that we have rules and regulations by the state is to create an environment, a business environment that's fair and predictable. And if we look at the minibus taxi sector, and I think this is one of the issues that we examine in depth in our book, we see the disadvantages of a form of regulation that only acknowledges minibus taxis to the exclusion of sedan taxis. But at the same time, we see a great deal of problematic behavior with the way informal taxis undertake their businesses, often to the exclusion and disadvantage of various economic opportunities. So I think we need to look at the issue from a scales perspective, opportunities on the one hand, constraints on the other hand.
One of the big things we've seen over the years has been the rise, it's just one example, of commercial shopping centres on the fringes of the township economy. And this is a really interesting example of like where, the shopping mall owning companies and supermarkets can go to a local municipality and say, well, we'll create 300 jobs with this supermarket, and if you give us planning permission in order to build it in this particular place. And often those supermarkets, they come with their own set of rules. They do create the jobs, but at the same time, they also come packaged in the mall. And in that mall, you'll find takeaway food. You'll find a liquor outlet, which is commonly owned by that supermarket. All of these businesses end up becoming part of the dynamic that helps to extract money from the township economy. And where, ironically, originally there were businesses in an informal setting which were condemned for the retailing of liquor. We are now replacing them with businesses that are now given licenses to do exactly the same business practice. But because of their power and because of their kind of leverage that they can have over the state and the money that they can bring to the table, they're able to just override the markets that are currently there. And I think this is one of the great challenges of our time in terms of if we want to grow a township economy, how do we create a fair playing field? And I think it's something that we're really not getting right at the moment, and something that we're going to have to think about very carefully going forward. And we see the same dynamics playing out with respect to the trading in liquor, the trading in groceries, the minibus taxi sector. And I think all of these dynamics, they work in ways that deny survivalist businesses the opportunity to get established and to grow. And I think, if you imagined yourself, Peter, trying to open a corner store with a supermarket up the street, the incredible difficulties that you would face to be able to do that. Now, you put yourself in the shoes of someone in a township economy. I think we really are creating an unfair playing field, and we need to think very, very carefully about how do we get that more level and more fair for everybody.
I guess some of those contestations that you're talking about play themselves out in other ways. I mean, anything you'd like to reflect on in that regard, Andrew?
I think one of the interesting differences between the townships that were planned in the 1950s and 1960s, so essentially the height of the apartheid period of spatial planning, and the townships that have been developed post-apartheid, is that in the 1950s and 60s, these townships were planned in a very rigid way. The infrastructure, the roads, bulk services were clearly well-defined. Homeowners were given slightly larger properties. And if we look at those townships over a lens of 50 to 60 years, and in some cases a little bit longer, we see a profound change. And much of the change lies in the investment by individuals into their properties. And these properties have transformed and changed remarkably. In fact, they're no longer recognizable, and they bear the hallmarks of a middle-class neighborhoods that wouldn't be out of place in context completely outside the township or even outside South Africa. And I think this is something that's very important to recognize. It's important that for the middle class to remain in the township, what is going to be absolutely critical for the future is to ensure that public space is well managed, and at the same time that the institutions that the middle class would depend on, such as schooling and housing and public transport, etc., is well provided for. And I think this is a huge challenge for cities across South Africa. And I think a key point is that many of these middle class neighborhoods that have arisen in places like Tembisa and KwaMashu play a key role in supporting the rate spaces of cities. So this is an interesting and important learning that we've had from looking at very different contexts and having the advantage of looking back over time.
Again, Andrew, thanks for the reflection on that. And I mean, if I think of some of the opportunities, if we've talked on the one hand of some of the contestations, if we think about some of the opportunities, what we're seeing, I think, has been quite a drastic shift in particularly vacancy rates in some of our central business districts across the country. And I wonder to what extent some of that formal space may shape up and provide opportunities for micro traders, thinking of opportunities of subdividing some of that space at ground floor reduction of rentals and so forth. Is this something, do you think, provides possibilities in places that up until this point have almost been unaffordable and inaccessible to some of the micro traders?
I think absolutely. There's been a lot of other studies done by various other people around the country, academics, universities, etc. One of the very interesting studies, I think it was by Tanya Zak, was looking at the rentals paid by informal traders in downtown Johannesburg. And if you look at it on a square meterage basis, the rents per square meter basically are more than what people are paying for office properties in Sandton. The difference is that informal traders are operating literally using 2, maybe 4 meters of space. The businesses rely on incredible efficiencies, and those efficiencies allow for the consolidation of many traders into one particular building, or the rethinking about the use of space. And I think that's where the decline of the CBDs in the context of COVID really does open up new opportunities for bringing, informal business, street trade, and other enterprises in. But just to take it back to the township, I think one of the big challenges we have is so much of our economy is concentrated within our CBDs and our suburbs and our kind of industrial areas. And one of the big interventions that really needs to happen is getting the investment environment right within the township context. And as Andrew said, there are many more middle-class parts of townships. There are many highly developed parts of townships. Yet here we are sitting in the city of Cape Town, and there's all of this talk about creating a new CBD kind of like north of Bellville, like up on the west coast. But meanwhile, we have Khayelitsha, we have land in Khayelitsha, it's zoned for business. If we were to focus our attention on getting the law enforcement environment more working and to get the policy environment right, we could actually take the economy to a place like Khayelitsha and create far more opportunities there. So I think instead of writing off so many places as just being too hard and going for greenfield developments, it really is time for policymakers to think very carefully about how do we get the investment policy right, particularly in the township economy, because we want people and we want more diverse trade within our CBDs and our suburbs, but similarly, we want to get more money into that township economy.
Naresh, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just want to contribute to the inverse of what Leif is talking about. If we're looking at having the right investment context in the township, I think we look at the CBD or the more established kind of real estate to have the right imaginative framework. And what I mean by that is I find that one of the reasons we may say that some of these conditions that we find in the township that are quite attractive, dense, and prolific, there's a reason that I feel that it will not happen in the CBD. And one of the reasons is that if the CBD has got a monopoly, a stranglehold where the formal property real estate agents are not, if they don't open up their imagination, you won't find this kind of clever use of space within the CBDs. And I find that the CBD often has a highly regulated real estate environment that is regulated on risk and your insurance policies in terms of having different types of functions next to each other. We've got an archaic town planning law and a city bylaws that looks at very prescriptive ways of how our spaces need to be configured. And what we find so alluring and exciting about the township economy is the kind of dexterity it has to respond to opportunities, those little traders. But the challenge with that is often it's an infringement on certain bylaws, specifically fire or circulation. So there's a fine balance between how to unlock a secure investment space relative to a really creative, productive, and imaginative spatial arrangement. So the examples that we're talking about, that Leif highlighted in the CBD in Johannesburg, it is no coincidence that those inventive real estate configurations with traders happen to take place in quite shadowy property ownership setups. It's not in the more established parts like Braamfontein or the banking core. It's within the migrant communities of the Ethiopian quarter where you're having a grey real estate configuration where there's not a lot of regulation. It is also owned by foreigners that come in with a very nuanced understanding on how to use space that often exceeds the imagination of kind of South African real estate operators and their kind of technical superpowers that come with them. So I think that there's a thing to learn between these two extremes, with the hyper-regulated formal property market and the irregular, very inventive kind of township market that also needs to be calibrated to be a little bit safer, to make it more investment friendly. And I think we could learn between these two extremes.
Leif, if I may, I just want to take us back one moment to that example you used about expansion versus let's call it infill, of using the township of Khayelitsha to leverage and develop the economy further. Some may say, but government's invested millions, and the relative in terms of infrastructure and investment and so forth, but the relative leverage and so that materialized there has been somewhat limited. How would you respond to that sort of critique of that sort of approach where people are saying, well, it sort of can't be done, it hasn't worked to date? Is it that the recipe's been wrong, or that the investment and the infrastructure that's been considered has not been appropriate for the needs of the market that can absorb that?
So much of what has happened in terms of developing township economy has been in such a piecemeal way, and there's a lot of politics involved. It's like the township, it's quite messy. There's a lot of opinion. There's a lot of kind of differing kind of perspectives on what should be done. And I think that has hindered a lot of the kind of the continual process of investment. So we see a stop-start kind of approach. And I think that's what the first major challenge. I think a second challenge, this particularly relates to private business, is like, if you were a business owner, why would you want to go to Khayelitsha? I mean, if you think about what are the key success factors for running a business, firstly, you've got to be able to make money, because that's why you're in business to start. But secondly, you need a premises that is going to be like convenient, reliable. It needs to be safe. Your employees need to be able to go there and to be able to spend time and feeling like that they're within a community of like-minded people and practitioners. They're not stepping out into the street, into a slum or into a taxi gunfight. And I think that we without a coherent approach, and without really getting the key success factors right in terms of knowing what businesses want, they've done bits and pieces, and there's the foundations of the opportunities are there. But we really need to say that more needs to be done that's experimental, that's brave, that really allows us to say, well, we've only got so many years left before people are going to kind of like give up on the notion of township economic development and just abandon it and kind of leave it be. And I think that, there's such an important role for government, because government, at the end of the day, regulates business, makes the laws that keep us safe, controls the services that we require. And I think to leave the township just kind of fall apart by the wayside would be a tragedy. And the private sector would get on board if we get the models right. And I think that we haven't got that 100% kind of unpacked just yet.
I think there is a case to be made to say that government investment has not been sufficiently bold. Yes, government has invested, but some of the major investments have been the shopping mall developers, and they have a very self-serving interest in the kinds of infrastructure that they have developed, and often the formula has been very exclusionary. It would be interesting for government to lead the way and say, well, we'll build the shopping malls and we'll build them in a way that the private sector can come on board in ways that are more suitable to the township environment. So that is something that I would like to see. Secondly, if we look at often beehives, and governments often talk about beehives as investments that haven't succeeded well in the township, I think there is enough evidence to suggest that one of the problems is that the beehives have been too small. We've seen examples of beehives elsewhere in South Africa where large units have been created, and these large units are all used today. And we're currently working in Hammanskraal, and the beehives that were created in the 1970s are fully occupied, but they provide larger space. So it's bolder investments. I think we would like to see the government acting in a much more bold way to define and to shape the kinds of investments that can have a significant impact on the future of the township economy.
I want to move us on into your concluding chapter. It's titled Protect, Contain, and Disrupt. And boy, that was before COVID hit. So I am interested to understand what your main recommendations were a year ago. How, if anything, would you change that or amplify certain of those recommendations a year on? In terms of mass disruption, I guess, I suspect that it's a different approach and different advocacy a year on, but let's test that. I mean, Andrew, your immediate thoughts on that?
I think the conclusions are still valid. Although there has been profound economic and social upheaval over the last year, the fundamentals haven't changed. And therefore, I think our conclusion holds valid. When we say protect, we're very much pointing towards the smallest, the poorest, those who are really just pursuing a very marginalized livelihood. And what we're saying is that those individuals should be permitted opportunities to trade. And there's going to be a lot more of them over the next 12 months. And so we shouldn't get fixated on whether they're breaking municipal bylaws about where, when, and how they conduct business. The contain is also focuses on some of the unhealthy, unacceptable business practices that need to be reduced because they limit opportunities for economic growth. There's a lot of anti-competitive behavior, for example. There's a lot of sale of contraband and products that are potentially unhealthy. So, for example, we would not like to see a proliferation of medicine which is not regulated in the township space. And there is increasingly amounts of contraband and illegal medicine sold, even in spaza shops. So this is an example of a practice that really ought to be contained. And the disruption that we are calling for is a much more profound disruption. We're looking for a disruption to systems that have got us so far but can go no further. We would like to see a fundamentally different relationship between small and big business. The business as usual approach, whereby large corporates as well as non-township residents make the most profit from the township and export and extract that profit outside the township, really ought to be disruptive. We'd also like to see greater disruption in terms of the way systems regulate business and the opportunities for different kinds of business. So overall, I think our conclusions still hold, and in some cases, I would say that they're more valid today than they were when we penned the conclusions.
There's something quite precarious about when we talk about the vulnerability of the township. I think we can talk about vulnerability in terms of one's livelihoods, but I think we can also talk about vulnerability in terms of the value of the township as being one of our few means to ideologically and conceptually shift what our urban future is about. Right now, I see it as a site that is offering unbelievable potential about what an urban life could be like, that is quite connected, it is quite inventive. I say that a lot, but it has a lot of interdependencies in there, and that a citizen can exercise their own agency to realize a future from that. And I think that that's quite an important kind of move in a post-apartheid democracy that we have, that the agency rests within individuals within a city. And if you find that there are cities that are able to support our aspirations as cleanly as possible, I think that the township offers it really well. The vulnerability around that, I think that it's what Andrew's talking about, is that we are seeing quite a toxic practice taking place where big established business is almost having an extractive pipeline to the township, where they are having a presence in there but not meaningfully contributing to the livelihoods of those communities. And then you're going to find a situation where the township will be seen as a resource, like we have coal and other mineral resources, but it will become a resource for other kinds of labor and goods and services. And I think what we're going to find is that we could lose this goose that lays this golden egg in terms of all its innovative and interesting insights, and we could lose that. So I think that there's another kind of level of vulnerability to it. So that idea of being disruptive and to contain and to protect the township, I think we need to make sure that we protect some of its fragile kinds of configurations that are both extra legal in some way, but incredibly productive in helping us conjure up what an urban future is. Because as an urbanist, I am desperately seeking what our future could be like. And I must say that of all the sites I've studied or spaces I've occupied and literature that I've exposed myself to, I find the township the most useful and hopeful arena to leverage a South African urban future on. Yeah, I do think that we just got to be careful about how open it is.
I'd like to try and get a sense of what the reaction to the book has been since it's been published. And, it lends itself, I get a sense that it lends itself very strongly into a series of sort of interactive case studies or, tutorials that you could look at online. Have you had any thoughts about that, and potentially a second volume if you would be able to invest more time, and particularly given, again, the pandemic and adapting some of the case studies to the circumstances that we find ourselves in?
Ghostbusters 2 won't be the film that everyone remembered. It was the original Ghostbusters that really made it. And I think that, it's a bit early for us at this point to be thinking about a follow-up onto this edition. I think, we launched the book last year, and we've had a really great response. But like with all things COVID, we've done a lot of things online. So we'd like to give the time some book to settle. I think we want to see it get into the right hands. We'd like to see it used by policymakers. We'd like to see it read by people in academia, read by the kind of development practitioners who we've engaged with, and I think who can really take value out of this. And I think that we've kind of cracked something that we think others have not been able to take on in the same way. The book presents an opportunity for others to be able to pick up from it and to do their own investigations and to be able to get out into the field and to try and understand, from a high level perspective, what goes on in this remarkable world. For us now, we're very much in practitioner mode again, getting the boots dirty. And our focus is very much on making the book impactful. And so we're talking the talk, and we now plan to walk the walk. So a lot of the findings, a lot of the things that we discuss in the book are now things that we are applying within our own development kind of space, the projects that we're doing and the activities we're up to. So I feel that, for the next year or so, we definitely are focusing on trying to get the book both read and also implemented.
We distributed the book to a number of individuals, and the feedback has been really positive. In fact, one of the people that we sent the book to said that they felt that every person in government, high-level government, certainly should get a copy of the book and consult the book. So that has been very positive. We're also planning to do a in-person book launch later this year, when hopefully conditions will arise, where we can bring together some key people. We plan to do one in Cape Town, one in Pretoria, reaching different audiences, and I think give the book a real push. So it's getting out there slowly, and I think this podcast that we're doing with you is the start of our efforts to really push the book a little bit harder.
If we have to talk about a next iteration about a volume 2, I think that we would be interested in, we almost see the book as a way for us to put in writing and words a set of preoccupations that we've had and insights that we'd like to share. We would like to imagine the next iteration to be things that are lived and experienced, and where we are able to take these lessons and see what they feel like tangibly in the ground, and to make sure that the next version of our work is read through an experience. So we are keen to intervene as much as we can within the township context as a way of experimentation, learning, and contribution.
I'd also like to add a final point. I think one of our experiences is that much research on the township and much government policy in respect to township microenterprises reflects a township that people want to exist rather than a township that actually exists. And I think what we've tried to do in our work is to focus on the township as it actually exists, warts and all. Some of it is good, but some of it is rather unpleasant. And I think as long as there is this imaginary township that speaks to policymakers and often planners and academics, I think we're going to see a perpetuation of policies and plans that aren't working very well and are not having the kind of impact that they ought to have.
We certainly wish you, the three of you, well in getting the book out there, getting a wider exposure. And again, from my side, thank you for giving us the time and the benefit of you being able to reflect on it. Where can people find out more about the publication? I think it was the book was published by the HSRC Press. I think that you can find on hsrcpress.ac.za. But are there any other platforms, whether it's Twitter or in terms of your own handles, that you'd like to share, perhaps?
The book is available from Loot as well, and if anyone's having difficulty, they can also reach out to the three of us. We have a small stockpile of books, and we'd be more than happy to help people out if they're struggling to access the book. They can also look at our respective websites, at the Urban Works website and the Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation website, picking up our Facebook and Twitter leads there, where we from time to time have included some information. I think on one of those sites you will find the book, the virtual book launch that we undertook early last year.
In fact, you reminded me that, Andrew, exactly that. Yeah, it was loot.co.za where I was able to pick up my copy of the book. And with that, colleagues, I want to really thank you. I wish you the very best. Most importantly, as I say to all our guests at the moment, is stay safe. Please look after yourself. And, it would be really great if in the months to come, we could possibly pick up a couple of the themes from this, or maybe one or two of the case studies, and go a bit more in depth in terms of the findings. It would be great to have you guys back on at a later stage. In the meantime, please do look after yourself. Enjoy the rest of the week, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And we would really enjoy another bite at the opportunity to go into some of the details.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.